Over the diagram from page 288 in your notebook and posted on the classroom. This is an overview of the digestive system. Right now we're zoomed in on the head region, and this red area I've added is the mouth, going down the back of the throat and then into the esophagus, just to make that a little bit clearer. So let's start with the mouth. That is more formally called the oral cavity. Now, in the back of the mouth, as we go down, this area here, which is sort of the junction between the trachea, which is labeled for us, and then the esophagus, this area right here is the pharynx. So let's add that in. In the mouth, kind of making up the floor here, this muscular area they're trying to point to is the tongue. And then right here above the tongue, in terms of labeling, there's this little structure that's hanging down, and that's what hangs down in the back of your mouth. That is the uvula. And that uvula is to prevent food as you swallow it from going up into the nasal cavity. So that sort of flips up and blocks that, much like the epiglottis blocks food from going down in the trachea. So we have three glands that are left. These are salivary glands. The one up here, kind of near the ear region, is the parotid. Then underneath the tongue is the sublingual, literally under the tongue. And then in the jaw region here, this is under the mandible, so that is submandibular. Now, working our way down, we're into the chest area. This is the tube, so the food has come through the mouth. It's now going down the esophagus. As we continue down, labeled for us here is the diaphragm that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. So the esophagus actually goes through the diaphragm and then joins right here, and then this is clearly the stomach. Now, in red here, I've labeled a couple of additional structures for us. I will add those later. We'll come back to them. Let's continue where the food would go. It comes down through the esophagus to the stomach. From the stomach, it's following down through this part of tubing. That's going to disappear down behind the large intestine into this general region here. So right here, underneath the stomach, we've got two labels, and then this one right here is the small intestine. And the small intestine actually has three parts to it, so we're going to come back and look at those later. Now, the food from the small intestine sort of passes back and forth as it's being chemically digested, and then it enters right here on the lower right-hand side. So this structure that goes up, over, down, and then curves is all the large intestine, but the large intestine has segments to it. So as the food from the small intestine enters the base here, this part takes the food upward. So this is the ascending colon because food is going upward. Now the food's going to travel across. So if I were cutting the body this way, this would be a transverse cut. So this is a transverse colon. From here, the food goes downward. That's descending. So that is the descending colon. Scroll down a little bit. The food has come down. At this point, it has to get to the center of the body. So it kind of makes this little S-shaped curve here. This is called the sigmoid colon, or just the sigmoid. Then it's stored temporarily in this little pouch here, sort of in the pelvic region. that is the rectum. And then it's going to leave the body through the opening in the floor of the pelvis. That is the anus. So just looking at the path that food is going to take, scroll up for a second. Food enters the oral cavity, goes down the pharynx, down the esophagus, to the stomach. From the stomach, it goes to the small intestine, back and forth, enters the large intestine, goes up the ascending colon, across the transverse colon, down the descending colon, through the sigmoid, to the rectum, and then out the body. There are some other structures here that we need to label. This large organ here on the upper right-hand side of the abdomen is the liver. And it is an accessory organ, making bile, storing it in the gallbladder, and then injecting it into our digestive tract in order to emulsify fat. Over on the other side here, this is the spleen. Let's go back down and deal with the primary things that are already labeled for you. So when I look at the base of the colon here, this is also called the cecum. This little extension here is actually the appendix. Let's get that labeled. Now, the small intestine actually has three regions. So one of them is a required labeling here, and that is this last part right before it enters the large intestine. This is called the ileum. Now, going back, as I look at the stomach here, the very first part of the intestine is called the duodenum, and that's not actually labeled for you. We're going to add it here. And then after that duodenum, which is a short region, there's a long section that goes back and forth before it becomes the ileum, and that part here is called the jejunum. And then somewheres partway through the jejunum becomes the ileum, and the ileum enters the large intestine. So now, going back up, there's two other structures here, actually three. Right here, this organ that's a little bit ghosted is the pancreas. We know it has an endocrine role, but also has digestive enzymes, so plays a digestive role. Now, I've added two junctions to the stomach. Where it comes down and from the esophagus to join the stomach, that is the cardiac sphincter. And the reason it's called cardiac is sometimes you get acid reflux. The acid from the stomach can come up through this valve, and it's in the region of the heart. And so you can feel a burning in the heart region, which actually is the burning of the esophagus lining. And so that's the cardiac region that you would feel that in. So this is the cardiac sphincter. And down here, before the stomach opens to enter into the duodenum or the small intestine, that is the pyloric sphincter. And a sphincter is nothing more than a circular type of muscle that controls things entering or exiting a structure. And we have several of those throughout our body. So zooming out, I hope that you found this video helpful in labeling the diagram and learning the structures.